Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Cowling, the Film Independent. Welcome to another Filmmaker Tuesday. Tonight is all about documentaries. Very pleased that we have a team from ITVS here to talk about the filmmaker-participant relationship. Participant, the new word for, the new term we use for subjects, right? Kind of implies a little bit more of a collaboration there. We'll get into that as well. So joining us today is Grace Anglin from ITVS. Grace is the Research and Evaluation Director. Hey, Grace, how are you?
Doing well. Happy to be here.
Where are you tuning in from?
San Francisco.
Okay. Are you all San Francisco?
We are.
Okay. Also here is Sherry Simpson. She's the Senior Director of Engagement and Impact Innovation. Hey, Sherry.
Unmute. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Paul, for having us.
Oh, you're welcome. And also Executive Coordinator Justine Rose Armen. Hey, Justine.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
So Justine is going to be kind of handling a lot of the online Q&As, questions in the chat. If you haven't any, often in the chat, we let you kind of mention who you are. You can put in whether you're a writer or director. I assume there's going to be a lot of documentary directors here, but also if you're a producer, we'd like to know that. Your social handles as well, but you can also drop in questions in the chat. Justine will be answering those a little bit later on at the end of the presentation. Sherry and Grace will be taking questions directly on camera. If you want to take question from ask them the question, we'll have you raise your hands later on, or just put it in the chat. So I'm going to sort of step off stage here and let Sherry and Grace take it away. Also, if you want to pin them, of course, you can pin their images using the pin option in the corner of their images so they'll fill the screen. So Sherry, Grace, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Paul. Well, welcome, everyone. It's really great to be here. I should say that this is really, in some ways for us, the culmination of a year-long study and probably even longer work being in the inquiry around changes in the documentary industry, but also very, very specifically looking at this relationship between filmmakers and the people who are actually in their films, those people whose stories are captured on film. And so Paul just let us know there are a number of documentary filmmakers here today, but also a number, probably even perhaps a larger number of storytellers who are working in the fictional area. But one thing we've discovered along the way is that the findings, which you're going to hear about in just a moment from this year-long study, I should say too, it was funded by the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, and the Ford Foundation, is really looking at, I think, the sort of power of storytelling itself, but specifically those people whose stories are told. We're really delving a little bit more into their world through this study. And so let me start off by saying, as a reminder, that the name of this particular workshop, we're really looking at a large-scale study, the very first of its kind, actually, and we'll hear about the numbers involved, but really looking at that critical relationship that's so often between filmmaker film participant that leads to, you'll hear actually what it leads to, because we're going to delve into the top lines in a moment. I should say that the study itself was conducted and led by ITVS, really in cooperation with an amazing design team. That design team were individuals from the following organizations, and I definitely want to bring them to the forefront because, quite frankly, we could not have done this without them. The idea here was not to have ITVS just lead a study, but to actually work in close proximity with the people in the documentary film industry. So they are, as you can see here, Brown Girls Doc, and I will say their names, it's extraordinary partnership over a year. Brown Girls Doc Mafia, Documentary Accountability Working Group, also known as DOG, Documentary Producers Alliance, Documentary Participants Empowerment Alliance, Forward Doc, Flaherty, Fourth World Media Lab, and Youth Effects. And I should say that the Empowerment Alliance is a new organization Their leader, Margie Ratliff, worked with us as a design partner on the participant side of the study. So let me just say a couple quick things about ITVS, because when we first presented this in-house at ITVS, our own colleagues were raising their hands left and right and asking the question, wait a second, why are we doing this work again? How did we get involved? And I'll say that the very quick origin story really is that starting, I'd say, in maybe 2018, there seemed to be, and maybe some of you may remember this too, there was a real rise in conversations at film festivals and sort of open forums, actually a number of articles written about, on the one hand, the golden age of documentaries, on the other hand, questions about the burgeoning industry of doc filmmaking around ethics and accountability. In very specific terms, we heard a lot more about compensation questions, actually about compensation, about how film participants, or again, subjects, have been involved with editorial processes. And really, as the industry itself grew, what are filmmakers doing and how are they working specifically with the people whose stories they're telling? And so I just want to say from our angle, as ITVS, the lead on the study, there's really no right and wrong about what we found or about what people are doing. It was really more a question of delving more deeply into the question of, as an industry, what are our practices? What seems to be working? What might we want to change? And in fact, that all led us to this moment. So you're really one of the first audiences that's hearing specifically about top lines. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, if you're not in the doc industry and you're wondering, who is ITVS? We are independent television service. We've been around for about 30 years, over 30 years. And we were conceived by independent filmmakers. So the idea, our work is, we're funders, we distribute on the public media system, and we still hold to that tenet of independent filmmaking is critical to really independent thinking and democracy as well. So we are funded in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and still hold that documentaries allow people to be educated in the civic space, to participate and to engage with civics in their communities. So I will pause there, because we're going to come back later and turn it over to Justine, actually, to share a little bit about how the evening's going to go. And so over to you, Justine. Thanks for having us, everyone.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Justine. As Paul mentioned earlier, I'm executive coordinator at ITVS, and I was a researcher and project manager on this study. So I'm popping on just to share a little bit about how the evening will go. Right after I'm done chatting, Grace will hop on and present the top line findings from the study. Please add your comments and questions in the chat as they come up. I will respond to any questions that are quick responses right away in the chat, and things that might require more discussion or explanation we'll save until the end of the presentation. And folks can then ask questions live. And then we will spend a few minutes regrouping and then close out for the night. So yeah, again, please put your not only just questions, any comments or thoughts that you have that come up as you learn about the findings from the study, put them in there. And yeah, we're excited to share the results with you. So I'll pass it over to Grace.
Thanks, Justine. So I'm going to dive into the findings. Before I can talk about what we found, which is the most exciting part, I have to talk a little bit about methodology so we can understand how we got to where we are and how we actually collected the information for this study. So at a really high level, we had a survey and focus groups with both filmmakers and film participants. And since we're going to be talking about data from two different data sources, or two different groups, really, filmmakers and participants, throughout the deck, I'll always indicate, or at least try to remember to indicate which perspective the data is coming from. And we'll also keep using these same sort of visual cues throughout, that red sort of signals data from filmmakers, and for the most part, brown will indicate data from film participants. So to collect data from filmmakers, ITVS and 40 other documentary organizations shared the survey that we drafted with their networks. So the goal was really to get a really broad cross-section of US-based documentary filmmakers. And from those 41 organizations, 678 producers and directors took the survey. And we conducted focus groups with a subset of those filmmakers. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about who, sorry, I'm going to shrink. I wanted to see all of y'all's faces, but now I can't see my slides. So I have to shrink y'all down to be really small. So actually, as somebody said, this is our first virtual presentation, but not our first presentation. And I feel like technology always minorly confuses me. But anyway, so as you can see here, our filmmaker sample set slightly skewed towards women, as well as towards white filmmakers. But one of the dreams of having a pretty large data set for a researcher at 678 is that you're actually able to do subgroup analyses. So we were able to look at different groups of filmmakers in addition to looking at them overall to understand how experiences and the ways in which they approach their practice may vary based on different groups. So about half of the filmmakers who took our study indicated that they were about midpoint in their career, and the rest were relatively evenly split between more veteran filmmakers and filmmakers who were earlier in their career. So kind of a nice subsection there. And we asked filmmakers to focus on one recently completed film as they took the survey. And 60% of those films received some type of more formal distribution, either through commercial media or public media, with 11% having a combination and about 20 to 25% having either just commercial distributions as HBO, Netflix, CNN, or public media distribution. So for film participant data collection, this probably comes to no surprise to anyone on this call. There's not a similar collection of organizations working with film participants as we had for filmmakers. So we had to come up with a different approach to actually reach film participants for the study. And we did this through a couple of different ways. For one, we set up a website for the project where film participants who heard about the study, either at a festival or because their filmmaker had also taken the survey, could go and sign up to take part. Select partners who had direct relationships with a core group of participants, invited them to take the survey. And actually the most effective method, about 2/3 of these participants actually came through online research, where we actually looked to see which documentary films came out in the last 3 years, and then looked online to identify the participants in those films and contact information for those participants. So through these methods, we identified 635 participants from documentary films, and just under 200 of those participants took part in the survey, which is a pretty good response rate, right under a third for this type of cold call effort. And this makes this the largest study ever to look at documentary film participants. And we also had a subset of those, 31%, who took part in our focus groups as well. So this sample is slightly more diverse than our filmmaker sample, but still also skewed towards women, as well as individuals who identified as white. But similarly, we were able to conduct subgroup analyses. And so we also asked participants what the film was about that they took part in. And there's a lot we could talk about here, but I want to primarily focus on this first column, that 42% indicated that they took part in a film actually about their life, that they were the primary subject, primary topic covered in the film. And I wanted to draw attention to this because some of the biggest differences that we found as we looked at the results had to do with whether or not the participant was in a film about their life or about some other topic. If you are a nitty-gritty detailed research person, we have a long appendix that goes into way more details about all of the methodology. But for now, we want to move on to get into the meat of the findings, which I think is generally what most folks find most interesting. So I want to start with the good news, which we heard that 89% of participants would take part in their documentary again if they were given the chance. So that's 89%. And of those, 95% indicated that they felt respected by their filmmakers, that they trusted their filmmakers, generally had a positive experience and relationship with the filmmakers. And we wanted to understand why folks were likely to participate again. So we asked them, and the vast majority indicated it was because making an impact was incredibly affirming. Participants described feeling that even the ability to make an impact felt like a form of compensation and really drove their participation, indicating that they were able to help alleviate feelings of isolation, bring attention to important work being done, or highlight their community in a way that was really impactful. As this one participant shared, the impact that the film had was well worth the time, energy, and challenges that came with participating with the film. Lives have been saved, systems and mindsets have been transformed, and new approaches to the work have been created as a result of the film. Now, of course, if 89% of folks would participate again, that means that you have 11% of individuals who either indicated definitively they would not participate again, or they likely would not do so. And again, we wanted to get under what was sort of leading to participants saying that, looking back in hindsight, they wouldn't do this, they would not participate in a film again. And the primary reason was that they felt that the filmmakers had actually lied to them or directly misled them about the film, and that the project that they ended up taking part in was not what they thought that they had signed up for. So this participant really sort of gets under that with this quote, sharing, the people I spoke with about the documentary claimed that they wanted to represent the facts and clear up misconceptions. Instead, the series created a firestorm of controversy due to its lack of historical accuracy. It hurt my professional reputation. It felt like a friend stabbing me in the back. So we had multiple participants talk about how the film itself was not what they thought they were signing up for. And we had others who regretted their participation describe that the filming process itself was not what they anticipated, indicating that filmmakers either sort of pressured them to say certain things on camera, to emote in a certain way, that they were asked to take part in reenactments or to repeat things ad nauseum in a way that they didn't really expect. So as this film participant shared, a lot of what you see in the documentary is honestly just staging and kind of like, well, we want to do this. Let's do a shot of this. And can you say something about this? So it's kind of just following instructions. I think that the priority was definitely on sound bites. And I wanted to bring in this pretty slide, which is an advertisement also for the report. There are lots of pretty graphics in the actual report, which we can link out to in the chat and also share at the end of the presentation if you want to get into more of the nitty-gritty. But I really like this graphic because it draws a connection between the point we were just talking about, would you participate in this film again? And another question we asked, how accurately did the film portray you? And you can see that everyone who indicated not at all or a little, as well as a sizable chunk of folks in the somewhat category, indicated that they were in the no or maybe group for participating again. And we wanted to dig into this and understand even more the connections between these questions and others on the survey. And we also found that folks who indicated that the portrayal was inaccurate were considerably more likely to say that the film actually had a negative impact on their community. For example, perpetuating negative stereotypes about that community. So really, if you want to boil it down, folks who were in the yes category on the right-hand side of this slide indicated it was all worth it because they made a positive impact. And quite a few folks in the no group said that actually the film had a negative impact. It was not an accurate portrayal, and thus they were unlikely to do it again. So of course, that's the high level overview of participation. But we dug into a lot of different aspects of the filmmaking process. So I want to sort of take a step back and kind of take us through the production and distribution process and some of our key findings that we had along the way. And even for folks who overall said that they would likely do it again, I think we can all attest for a lot of relationships and any relationships or family members that we have of any kind, they're complicated and bumpy at times. And that's the case here as well. So definitely in this presentation, we're going to point out some of the sticky points because we think that that's what's most interesting and where we can have the most conversation as an industry. So starting with when participants were actually being asked to participate in the film and sign up. So the vast majority understood why the filmmaker was making the film and specifically why they were being asked to participate in it. However, other details about the filmmaking process, details about sort of the legalese and business side of participation were far murkier for a lot of participants. And while release forms do outline some of these details, many participants indicated that they were complex and hard to understand. As this one film participant shared, honestly, dumb it down. It just looks like this huge legal form that I had to fill out. And I'm like, I don't know what this says. So getting into some of the nitty-gritty here, 30% of participants indicated they didn't understand whether or not the filmmaker would have the ability to sell or license their story, before filming started. And 39% didn't understand whether or not they would have access to the footage that the filmmaker was taking or to the film itself. And some participants told us in focus groups or in open-ended questions on the survey that this really did catch them out, that at the end, and particularly not understanding whether or not they would have access to the footage or to the film, really surprised them at the end. As this one participant shared, I can't get a personal copy of the movie. Once it's sold, that's it. And I was totally unaware of that. It's like, how could you give years of your life to the film and you can't even get the finished product without trying to bootleg it off the internet yourself? So some other areas where a chunk of participants didn't understand what they were getting into. 23% said they didn't understand whether or not they would be compensated or reimbursed before filming started. And a higher 39% indicated they didn't understand that they'd be offered other types of non-financial support. So these are things like legal assistance or mental health or trauma-related support. And 22% didn't understand the risks of participation. And I think this is a really important number to focus on, that before they actually signed up, they didn't understand the potential risks of taking part in a documentary. This participant shared, the release is only about giving our permission to be filmed, to have the camera on us. It does nothing to protect us. And I really like this quote because it actually summarizes what we heard from quite a few participants, as well as some filmmakers in the focus groups, where they really started to draw a line and a distinction between releases that are really intended to protect insurers, distributors, and filmmakers versus a true informed consent process that's about trying to protect participants themselves. And that oftentimes in conversations, and honestly, and even some of the initial design for this study, those processes can be a bit conflated, but that it's really important to draw those clear distinctions between the legal release and more of an informed consent process. So now I want to move on to talk a little bit about the filming process itself, which in particular for participants who want to film about their own lives can pretty much be summed up as intense. And that many participants were surprised by how intense this process was, indicating that they felt that at times filmmakers didn't quite understand the mental gymnastics that they were going through to tell their story, that they were unclear on how long it would take, that the amount of interviews or amount of time that they would be involved in the project was longer than they anticipated. And in some cases, just having a camera follow you around at your job or in your personal life, that they didn't quite understand how impactful that would be for their lives. And, I want to kind of tie this back a little bit to the fact that, as we said up front, filmmakers really did have the trust of participants, and participants, for the most part, really respected the filmmakers and actually really valued that relationship and saw it as a positive. But that relationship also made the intensity of the filming process somewhat complex, with participants indicating that it was harder at times to set boundaries with filmmakers because of those close, trusting relationships. As this participant shared, I was lucky that I had a friendship and a close relationship with the director. I think in some ways, because you're close with people, you kind of let them push the boundaries more and then maybe get out of your comfort zone. So I did want to take a minute to talk a little bit about compensation in a section that I'm affectionately calling Money Talks, but it isn't the loudest. As Sherry mentioned, compensation has been something really at the forefront of a lot of the discussions that have happened in the industry in the last couple of years around filmmaker and participant relationships, and one in which there are actually a lot of disagreements about if compensation is ever appropriate given journalistic standards, and if so, in what contexts. So I wanted to start, this is switching to actually share data from the filmmakers a little bit now that we talked, surveyed 678 filmmakers, get a sense of how common actually is it for folks to compensate. So in response to our survey, 20% of filmmakers indicated that they had provided participants an honorarium or compensated them for their time, or given them the opportunity to participate in back-end profit sharing on their most recently completed film. And an additional about 10% provided other forms of compensation, like archival fees or location fees. And filmmakers were considerably more likely to provide to offer participants compensation if they were earlier in their career or mid-career than those who had been in the industry for longer. And we also heard that or found that participants were more likely to be offered compensation if they were from communities that had faced systemic oppression or injustice, if they participated on the film for a longer months or years versus a shorter period of time, or actually if they had a personal connection with the filmmaker. And much like in industry discussions of compensation were also very prominent in our focus groups, with a lot of filmmakers speaking about them at nauseam, and similarly conversations about when it may or may not be appropriate to compensate. What's interesting is that it was actually discussed less from participants. It's not that participants didn't talk about this issue, it's just that it was not the primary driver for their participation, and for most was not the primary area that they wanted to draw attention to for change in the industry. As this participant sort of summarizes, I mean, money is great and you need it to pay the rent, but I don't think that that's a part of the documentary process. So while most participants sort of fell in this category of, yes, of course, money is important, but it's sort of not our main focus, there were some exceptions. In particularly, if participants did fall in that category I discussed earlier, where they felt that the filmmakers had mistreated them or they had a particularly bad experience on the film, they were far more likely to call for compensation. And participants who were in a film that did actually sell for quite a lot of money and were sort of on the outlier side of making millions at the back end were more likely to call for some type of compensation, like back end profit sharing, to be a part of the experience. So I want to also talk about another area that has been a sort of primary part of conversations more recently in the field, and that's around editorial control. And similarly, sort of start with what we found out from filmmakers, which is that 36% of filmmakers indicated on their most recently completed project that they actually sought editorial feedback from the participants involved in their film. And we found similar patterns, as I just discussed, for compensation, with filmmakers earlier in their career more likely to seek editorial feedback, and them being more likely to seek it from participants who were on the project for a long period of time or were from communities that had faced systemic oppression or injustice. We also really wanted to get under what does this really mean when you're seeking editorial feedback, because more than a third is actually quite high. And so the vast majority of filmmakers shared that while they're seeking feedback from participants, they're maintaining ultimate editorial control. And that they were seeking feedback in one of the following kind of three main areas. One, filmmakers were interested in editorial feedback, in particular, if they felt their film might pose a safety or legal risk for participants, wanting to have the participants, or in sometimes their legal representative, actually have the opportunity to take a look at cuts of the film or the final, or close to rough cut, close to final cut of the film to make sure that, any details that could put the participant at risk were taken out. So we had other filmmakers who shared that they were happy to cut personal details from the film if they were sort of tangential from the main topic of the film. So taking out the detail doesn't change the thesis, doesn't change the meaning of the film, but the film participant is uncomfortable with having those details in. That's the type of feedback that they were happy to receive and generally would accommodate. And then we had other filmmakers who really saw, and particularly if a film was about a participant's life and really was speaking to a major experience that they had, felt that showing cuts of the film to the participants, even seeking their editorial feedback, was closer to actual fact-checking in a sense, that making sure that this general portrayal feels like you're generally capturing your feeling or your experience at sort of that high gut check level. And that type of feedback in those categories that I just described is generally what participants were also sort of comfortable with. Most participants did indicate that it would be nice to see the film, and particularly if it is about their lives, or if they're an expert and they're relaying, technical important details, wanting to make sure that in the edit, it's still accurately, reiterated back to the audience was really important to them. As this participant shared, what really determines how the story is told is the editing. Things can be totally taken out of context or highlighted in a weird way. If it's about our lives, we should have the opportunity to review that material and say, I'm okay with it, or please don't put that scene in there. It makes me really uncomfortable. And while participants generally felt and kind of agreed in focus groups with this level of review, multiple, even in different focus groups, described the film as the filmmaker's baby and really recognized that even if they weren't happy with the way everything was cut, that they understood that it made sense for filmmakers to have the ultimate editorial control and they were okay with it, but that they felt that they should have a voice in the process. And I do like to bring this sort of slide in while we're talking about editorial feedback, even though it's kind of moving back earlier in the process about actual filming, to share that 50% of participants indicated that they were involved in decisions about what would be filmed and actually what would be off limits as well. And of course, if you're not capturing it on camera, it's not making it into the editing suite. And this is really more so where participants talked about exerting control over the film and what that ultimate film looks like is by their ability to actually influence what they say or where the filmmaker is able to film and what they're able to film. Okay, so I want to now talk a little bit about the release and distribution process section called "The Film Is Out. Can I See It?" So we actually heard that 41% of participants did not see the final film before it was shown to the public. And this number is lower at closer to 30%, but it's still 30% for participants who were in a film about their own lives. So this is a film, it's about you, you're the main sort of subject for the film, and yet 30% had not seen it before the public did. With multiple participants actually just sort of sharing the same very simple sentiment, kind of captures the thought though. I saw the series on the streaming service, not through the producer or the filmmaker. In general, participants the vast majority of them found the distribution phase to be the most challenging part of the process, indicating that they really didn't understand what was involved with distribution, that once we got to this phase, that communication really reduced and that they didn't really know what was going on, and it felt a bit like a black box. As this participant shared, we rarely hear of anything from the distributors. If we want an update, we will Google the name of the documentary and it'll pop up with something new. And I'm like, oh, that would have been nice to know. There wouldn't be a film without me and my family participating in it. So I didn't understand why we weren't being communicated with more. And I do think it's important to note two things here. One, that, as if we go all the way back to the beginning, most participants are taking part in order for the film to get out into the world and to make that impact. So distribution is both important to participants, but also at the same time, confusing and somewhat unsatisfying for a lot of them in different ways. And I also think it's really important to note that this phase is probably not surprising to anyone on this call, was also really frustrating for filmmakers. We had multiple filmmakers even sort of point to this sentiment that we heard really echoed from participants, that they themselves didn't know what was going on in the distribution. For the distribution of their film, or once they got distribution, marketing, communications, and publicity sort of left their hands as well. And so their ability to maintain a positive relationship and to continue to communicate with participants was actually actively a challenge. And sorry, for participants in general, but in particularly for participants whose films did reach that widespread distribution and the film was really out there in the world, that widespread release had quite an impact on participants. So overall, most participants, 94%, indicated that being in a film impacted their personal or their professional life. For 86%, that was overall a positive impact. But for 8%, and we have about 50 people on this call, so that would be multiple people in the room here. I'm not going to try to do math live, but 3 to 5 who would have actually said that this experience had a negative impact on their personal or professional life. So sometimes an 8% doesn't seem like a lot, but when you think about something negatively impacting someone, it is kind of a lot to be 1 in 12 people. And even with people who had positive and negative experiences, in general, about a third were not prepared for the impact that the film had on their life. So 34% said the degree of the impact came as a surprise. And in particularly, for film participants who were in a film about a really difficult topic. We had participants who were in films where they talked about mental health challenges or traumatic experiences, and particularly were surprised about and not really prepared for the impact of the film. As this one participant shared, strangers continually email me. I've had good and bad experiences. A lot of people who reach out to me are in a bad place. It's a lot of emotional labor. I don't regret doing it, but I definitely wasn't necessarily fully prepared. I would say lack of privacy is one of the main concerns. And for some film participants who did take part in our study and in our focus groups, those concerns were major and actually translated to safety concerns for them or for their family. As this participant shared, I did get hate mail, like, how dare you say that? And we're gonna get you. I was a little bit worried for my wife because she lives with me. If I was alone, there would be less worry. It does create tension. And I think it's really important to note that both of these participants were ones who I just quoted were ones who indicated that they would take part in the film again, if given the opportunity. But that they just were not prepared and did not quite understand what they were signing up for, and were surprised by the lack of support after the release of the film. And I wanted to circle back to this finding I shared the very beginning of my presentation that 22% of participants didn't understand the risks, the potential risks to participating. And as we just heard, those risks can be quite serious. So I like to sort of pause here and say, let's take a breath, because I do know that those last few quotes, and in particular the last one, are really heavy. And, you know, to sort of also remind ourselves that I'm drawing out some of the points on this in this presentation that I think are worth consideration for the industry, but that many participants do have a positive experience. And wanted to sort of share this quote to kind of bring us back up a bit. I felt that it was a very cathartic experience. I appreciated the filmmaking team's craft and their skill. They got a lot of footage, asked really good questions. The film crew exercised great care with every aspect of it. They took the time because they cared about the story, and the end result was really great. And so what's next? We asked both filmmakers and film participants what was needed. And in particularly participants who were in a film about their own life called for more support and resources. They were 2 to 3 times more likely to call for them. So I wanted to focus specifically on their responses here. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of participants were surprised by how much it took to take part in a documentary film. And so 40% indicated more information on what to expect would be useful, as well as more involvement in decisions as filming took place. Just slightly less than that, 37% called for more support after the film was released. And around a third called for other types of support, such as counseling, easier to understand release forms, or an easier way to share feedback with filmmakers. So we also heard from filmmakers that around half would have ideally on their prior project, their most recently completed project, done something differently with how they worked with participants. And so we wanted to understand what made it challenging, or maybe what contributed them to not being able to work with participants in their ideal way. And 46%, just under half, indicated a lack of resources, and around 15% indicated other challenges, such as differences in production team perspectives or approaches, or distributors' standards and practices, or funder agreements and requirements. And here I did want to point out a difference between commercially produced and publicly produced and distributed films. Films with commercial distribution, where those filmmakers were considerably less likely to indicate a lack of resources was a challenge than those with public media distribution. And the opposite was actually true for production team perspectives or approaches. So folks who ended up with public media distribution were less likely to indicate challenges with their production team. And filmmakers called for sort of similar tools and supports to help them work with participants, and kind of on the flip side of the coin, as we heard from film participants, with easier to understand release forms and consents at close to 2/3, so very high. I mean, 3/4, sorry, down to 2/3 on the next one. 2/3 ways to connect participants to counseling and legal supports, and 57% indicating they could use more resources or training. And, you know, even though filmmakers were calling for resources and training and supports, filmmakers also indicated, you know, we heard this quite often, that a one-size-fits-all approach is also not one that was recommended. As a filmmaker shared, how participants are treated in documentaries is absolutely essential to reform so that less harm is done to their lives. With that said, I'm against blanket prescriptive best practices, because each participant and relationship is different and complex. And of course, we only spoke to filmmakers and participants for this study, but they're part of a much larger ecosystem that, if we're really talking about change, will involve, you know, other aspects of funders, distributors, educators as well. As a filmmaker shared, the field is changing quickly, and while filmmakers are taking on more and more responsibility for creating ethical work and working with participants, the funding community is not moving as fast. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing so that we can see faces more as we open it up here for Q&A. Thanks everyone for listening. Justine, I'll throw it over to you and see if you want to bring up any specific.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up Steve's questions actually. First, he asked if just interested in knowing more about the subject matter of the films where participants felt misled or lied to.
That is a great question, and it honestly was all over the board. It included, for example, I'll just give a couple of examples to help round that out a little bit. So in one case, a participant thought that they were going to be in a film about a sort of larger, I'm just use vague terms here, but like a larger aspect of their community. So this is not what it is, but could be an example. Like, well, let's make a film about a farmer's market, but instead the film became about one farmer. And so they were like, suddenly I'm in a film about myself, and I wouldn't have signed up for that. So that's one example. Others were, historical films where maybe they were more sensationalized than they anticipated them being. And yeah, so really it's a whole gamut, and it included individuals in films about their lives, as well as individuals who are sharing their professional perspectives. Yeah, so and it's not so I feel like sometimes people ask I'm rambling, but is it just sort of the films that where maybe you're purposely trying to sort of hide your angle? And that was definitely not the case. So we had participants say that sometimes filmmakers just changed their mind even, but then they should have had an opportunity to pull out if they were making a different film than they thought they were signing up for. That's my long response.
That's great. And there was another question actually. It was asking if we assume projects will go to public media and TV, and I think I responded to that, which was that we had filmmakers respond to us and who had projects distributed on every possible platform, including self-distribution and film festivals. But the second part of the question, wouldn't an independent project with distribution controlled by the director-producer affect what could be available to participants? Which I think the short answer is yes.
Yeah, and I think that if I'm understanding that quickly, I feel like it kind of connects to that last point where, or one of the last points I made, where lack of funding was definitely a challenge for many filmmakers, and that it was more likely to be a challenge for filmmakers without commercial distribution. So even with public media, where budgets are smaller, or also, a lot of independent makers end up on public media as well. Is that answering? I don't know who asked that question. Is that answering it?
That was Steve.
I've reappeared to encourage more people to turn on their cameras and ask questions to you face to face. I'll break the ice a little bit more and ask. It's interesting that a lot of participants said that they never saw a copy of the film. They never saw the film until it was screened publicly. I find that quite staggering, actually. Do you know why that is? Do filmmakers, does it not occur to them? Are they just too busy to even sort of do private screenings for participants? Are they scared of showing it to them? Or do you know why that is?
I mean, I can jump in on this, and we can maybe put some thanks, Paul. Put some surround around it as well. I think that a lot of it, for some, it may be due to standards and practices. Sometimes, again, within the sort of more journalistic world, there are a lot of ethical practices that suggest not showing film to film participants before it goes out, because that relationship is just construed very differently. Some standards and practices really don't encourage that, because I think a lot of it is sort of a bridge from the journalistic practices that help to define the doc world, which said, this is really not in a place to involve participants, because it really is the filmmaker's story. So that's one angle. But then I think that there are several others as well. And maybe turning it back over to Grace, if you have additional thoughts about that the phase of distribution and our numbers there.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that that did surprise us, and we did the film participant survey second, so I might have asked filmmakers more questions about that if we had done it in the opposite way. Though I have heard from participants, I mean, from filmmakers in the couple of conversations we've had about this, you know, a range of things from, yeah, they weren't allowed to buy sometimes also streaming services. That's sort of a rule, even if it's not tied to distribution, more tied to kind of wanting to keep a lid on things, I think, to people not thinking about it, to some people saying that they were, you know, waiting, limited the likelihood that the participant could tell them or ask them to change something they didn't want to change. I've also heard that. So those are all just things I've heard in kind of settings like this. So I also encourage other people, I would say, like in discussion, to sort of, if they have a response to that here as well, because we didn't ask that explicitly. This is just sort of things we've heard.
Yeah, and I'll also add to that, and we also want to encourage everyone, as Paul has already said, to feel free to, chime in, raise your hand, or just unmute. Some of the conversations as well that I've had were really about, the sort of reality of being a filmmaker, making a documentary over many, many years. And we actually recently, I've heard this again and again, that if you're in a process of working with folks for years, and then that's that period where you don't know who you'll be distributing with, or in fact, if it's going to get distribution, the challenges of continually being in touch with the film participants to give these kinds of updates. And over time, that sort of radio silence can really be, challenging for both the filmmaker, but also, of course, even more so for the participant. So going back to the high level of why are we doing this? We're interested also in knowing this so that we can perhaps look at what does need to change. What do filmmakers need during that distribution period? I mean, we're involved with distribution as well that could really support them. And we know that what you put in, you get out. So this whole idea of people also saying that they'd love to have more time to develop this participant relationship to create more communication and understanding is another critical area that seems to be, just in question. Like, what else can we all be considering and doing? Looks like we have a hand raised.
Yep.
Mr. Wilkerson, I can see your.
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I know that through the film editing process and dealing with individuals in a documentary setting, I think that we all know that once all that material is gathered, audio is gathered, you're going back to the editing phase and you're bringing it in. And like you said, we're all storytellers. And the amount of information that was gathered is going to be distributed in that fashion where we have our climax, our acts, or however it is you see this unfolding and which direction it can take, because we all know the script isn't written until it's edited, right? Okay, now I'm not justifying anything or any ill practices that are out there, but we also know that during distribution times that a filmmaker is restricted on the amount of how much they can put out there without being cut short on any distribution platform or any festival for whichever direction they want to go. So it's limited there. And I agree, if there's a project extending over 6 months, a year, there's so much time. And by the time any one of those participants, no disrespect whatsoever, has the hand to even hear it and then say, hey, I don't agree with that, or I feel I was taken out of context there. We're talking about after the massive amount of efforts and work that has been put into, already been edited and then released. And now we're having a co-director in the midst of everything that could want to change the overall direction of the final product. It just seems like I can see how they can be affected or not, but I don't know of a solution that would help balance that participant filmmaker distribution agreement to where we can all be cohesive, unless you just have a very understanding producer or cinematographer and all that is known up front prior to going into the project, that some of this stuff could be taken, it could be taken out of context, but not to a degree that now I'm rambling. Okay, so.
Well, our team knows we'll just all jump in, and there may actually be other folks here, in this room, virtual room with us, who also might want to chime in and offer thoughts on that. I should say I've been a filmmaker. I'm working more in the impact area now at ITVS and was co-lead on this study. I think that and actually I'll just kind of share two quick things here. One is that in the course of doing this work, an unofficial conversation with a distributor made the point that, hey, look, this is all in the hands of the relationship that you build with the film participant, that this individual who I spoke with actually challenged the notion in some ways of even having the study, because they were saying, look, it's all about the relationship that you build with that film participant. And so, who is accountable to tell anyone anything about how to make that work? And it was a very interesting counterpoint, right, to this idea that what does the industry as a whole want to do? Because what I'm hearing in your comment is that it really comes down to how do we manage the changes and the communication along the way with those film participants? When and how do we have some of those conversations that may bring into perspective how the project is changing or how we're evolving? And so some of this, the word that kept coming up a lot is communication. And as simple as it sounds, that was a large part of what people have been bringing up to us in conversation. It's just, how you manage how the project is evolving and what we choose and when to share that evolution with these individuals. And again, to your point, which I think is a really powerful point, that look, this project is evolving, but then, if you show it to somebody and they are like, wait a second, that's a tough conversation to have, but it really speaks to this bigger question of ongoing consent as well. So maybe I'll put a pause and, open it up. It looked like, Grace, you wanted to say something, and if anybody else wants to offer thoughts.
I think it's really a great question. And I think one thing I think that we heard strong and clear is at that upfront point, just being clear on what the process is. So multiple participants, some were actually told, oh, you'll be able to see it, you'll be able to provide input, and then didn't get that chance. And they were the most negative about the editing phase. Ones who were like, I knew I wouldn't be involved, like, clear up front. Then there was sort of less, maybe they would say, yeah, it would have been nice, but there's less disagreement. I think it's that upfront expectation setting. And one thing that multiple said is like clearly outlining like when and how you would be involved in those later phases as important.
Yeah, this is Nikki. Have a say, hey, I raised my hand. I'm driving, so I can't like look down, so please forgive me. I have a sort of a comment and a question about surrounding the topic. When you're dealing with one subject and you're dealing with, okay, you've started one way and the stories change a little bit and you have to keep their trust. When you're dealing with multiple subjects and they're against each other, they have totally diametrically worldviews and points of view. And I'm actually dealing in a crime situation. So, having done 18 hours of interviews with the LAPD, I now, all of a sudden, I find myself sitting there filming in a jury box at an evidentiary hearing where the police officer's standing on the stand and looking at me like stunned. And so how do you guys navigate, like when when you become an advocate, when you become, your point of view changes from being the objective documentarian to going, wow, something's wrong here. And I'm just curious if anybody's ever dealt with anything like that. And, I just feel like everybody's going to hate me all the way around, but I'm just kind of, trying to navigate that and what my obligation is to get back with people and say, hey, let me tell you what happened. Things have shifted and all of that.
Well, Nikki, thank you so much, and be careful driving. We really appreciate that comment, and I think it really speaks to the sort of the silo effect as well. Like, when you're deeply into a project and you're trying to digest, while filming and making a project, what's going on. So, totally can relate to that as a filmmaker. I think based on the study, though, and I, bring it back to one of the key conversations that we've heard throughout, and, Grace just put it very powerfully, is the right? The choice of when we share about our process. And I will say that we, heard from a journalist recently in a conversation that bringing forward what we don't know and what we're not certain about is actually a powerful way to communicate as well. We tend to really want to focus on the things that we know and understand because that's the work that we're doing. There's also the lack of knowledge of what is going to happen in the process, that it's fair game to say this is an evolution and, it's going to be a while before we necessarily talk. It's going to be a while before I necessarily have the full story, but leaving that somewhat open-ended rather than, again, locking ourselves into a process that may not actually work when we're in the real time of making the film. So just throwing that out. And yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah. And the reality just being, the length of time that one can be on, the sheer length of time. Again, some of the projects that we make at ITVS have gone on for years, as I know might be very familiar to many people on this call. So there is that reality too of complete changing the zeitgeist of what you thought your film would be coming out 3 years ago. And actually the world is rapidly changing as well. So lots of things to be managing potentially there. Yeah, thanks for that question, Nikki. I want to bring up something. Yeah, no, absolutely.
There's a question in the chat too, Sherry, if you.
Okay. All right, well, let's keep going with the chat. Looks like we have some more questions there as well.
Okay, so yeah, it looks like Justine answered this, but I'll go into a little bit out loud as well. So there's a question about the demographics of filmmakers and participants involved, and if we saw differences based on those characteristics. So filmmakers who identified as one or more races other than white, so as here maybe BIPOC filmmakers, were more likely to call for changes into the industry, and were more likely to already be doing some of the things that we were discussing around compensation or around editorial control, and to be calling for additional changes moving forward. So we did see some changes in practice there. Even when sort of controlling for distribution, which we also saw changes based on where things were distributed. For participants themselves, where this data was a little bit conflated because film participants who were white were considerably more likely to be in a film where they were sharing an expert sort of opinion versus about their own life, where BIPOC film participants were more likely to be in a film about their own life. And that was really the primary driver. So unfortunately, we weren't able to sort of further tease out between that because there was such sort of a conflation between those two things. They were in different types of films, and that made such a big difference that's really what we saw as far as that. And then of course talked about like earlier career versus mid and veteran also had sort of similar differences as I described earlier, with being more likely to call for changes and already be doing some things differently. If you were earlier in the career, more likely to be compensating. We didn't see differences really based on gender or age, outside of the fact that age is related to where you are in your career. But no real differences on those areas. And yes, the appendix, if you really want to get into it, has all the subgroups for every question. Not all the subgroups, all the major subgroups for every question.
I have a question about compensation. I think in your slide, it was like 20%, right? Filmmakers compensated their participants. How do you see that move changing over the next sort of 10 years when as people become more savvy? And there's a lot of documentary and docuseries on streamers where people think there's big money there. I'm just curious if we'll see a shift there.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And as far as like the industry and if we think we'll see more of a shift, I will leave to Sherry, and if anybody else on the call who has some perspective on this wants to share. But I will say that the findings predict a shift, with the fact that the earlier folks were in their career, the more likely they were to be compensating. So that actually indicates that practice is evolving. sort of independently. So if you're earlier in your career, you were more likely to have compensated on your most recent project. Indicates to me that compensation will grow. But that's the fact-based thing I can say. But Sherry might have some perspectives from the industry.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think, and what we are attempting to do here is stick with the facts, and not be so interpretive necessarily. But I will say that what comes up, I mean, even within ITVS, right, we have an open call, as many of you know, and we're really working within those standards and practices that were developed through the journalistic lens. So we're not necessarily in a position to be able to pay and compensate. So within our own practice at ITVS, that's something that we are not necessarily doing. But I think that what people are doing more is becoming really clever, right, about how to compensate, right, for things that really do make a difference. And so we are seeing more, I think it was mentioned, non-financial compensation, and also more film participants asking, coming in, or filmmakers, about producing credits or getting some kind of credit on the film. And so while that's certainly not a financial, windfall per se, this is a question that filmmakers are often asking us at ITVS. And so I think when it comes to looking at things, and I'll kind of look a little more closely at those situations when it is a film about someone's life, and they are sort of the central film participant. It has come up. I'm going to say that I'm aware of, and I'm not on the production side at this particular time, but at least in 3 cases where there was a possibility of bringing in a filmmaker as a producer. And that speaks to the level of input that person has in their own story, but also, giving them some acknowledgement as well. So I think that's a very interesting, we're definitely going to be seeing probably a lot more of that.
That's interesting, because in fiction, we're hearing a lot amongst producers now of trying to make sure that producer credits, especially in fiction, aren't just sort of thrown out like candy. That people who get the producer credit have to be the producers.
Right.
This is now at odds with what you're saying in docs, right?
Yeah.
Would there be a new credit you would offer these people, like
participants
who are not producers, but the film wouldn't happen without them, so they are integral to a success of it.
Right, actually, and I should say too that because within the public media system, the sort of, how do we determine who gets what credit? It is definitely also beyond, the sort of, it's very discriminating. And so there are still, to your point, Paul, a lot of conversations and, sort of criteria with regard to who gets a credit at any point. In fact, even like executive producers, who aren't participants, it's a question of, well, what did they do? Let's look at this. It's heavily scrutinized. So not quite sure.
Consultant is what Steve said in the chat.
Yeah, consultant. Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's certainly, definitely appropriate. And again, a lot of this, since what we're at least finding from this study is that the film participants are not thinking they're going to cash out or looking for a big payday. Being able to acknowledge their role in some way does seem to be, and again, with the early career filmmakers and, filmmakers who are working with more trauma-related stories, certainly feels like that will be coming up more and more. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to share, it's like to your point, that I feel like some of the discussions around production credits or other credits come with a recognition that a lot of participants do more than just being interviewed. And this is another like shameless plug for like looking at the report. But I just pulled up this page from it here where you can see how participants contributed to the film. Of course, most were interviewed on one-on-one interviews, but that more than 75% of participants in films about their lives provided archival material. More than 2/3 discussed the direction of the film. Just under half recommended other participants. So that sort of this sense that they're doing real work to make the film happen, even beyond just, being on camera, that there's sort of a larger role there as well.
Right. Contrary to what I said just now, it sounds like they're kind of producing.
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah. We are running out of time, but we don't want to be in the situation where everyone is asking questions as we've got 5 minutes left. So I don't want to hold the mic, please. Anyone else with questions now? Now's the time to ask. Do we have any more in the chat? Anyone? Anyone?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we do have a couple of questions for you all, if you'd indulge us, if we can. And thank you so much, Paul, for creating a space for this. We do have a brief survey, and this is not so much about this presentation as it is, if I go back to my original opening statements, one of the things that we're interested in as a documentary field, and certainly at ITVS, is in knowing what you all think, what storytellers think about your thoughts on these findings. And so this is a QR code which takes you directly to a very quick survey where we're interested in what struck you about these top lines and these takeaways, maybe relative to your own practice, relative to the industry at large. And we know that there are many people here who aren't per se documentary filmmakers, but we're still interested in knowing what struck you about these findings, if anything. And the why of this will help us to figure out as well, as an organization that funds and distributes, what might we need to focus on in the future, and what's really connecting with you when you hear these top lines. So if you have an extra moment as we kind of, move out, if you wouldn't mind just jotting in. This is a collaborative filter question. It's this QR code is generated through our doc scale survey mechanism, which is a polling system we sometimes use at ITVS to really connect with audiences to understand a little more what you're thinking, especially in long virtual presentations where we might not get to hear from everyone. So thanks for checking that out.
Thanks for sharing that. If people need to contact you, what's the best way to reach out?
Great question.
I think our email address, let me put this in here. I think research@itvs.org is still working, which we set up for people taking the survey. And it goes to the three of us and our colleague Zoe, who is still on vacation, so not here today. So it goes to all of us. So please do that. And the survey the study is available on our website. As well. So, and you can reach out to itvs.org. We're small enough that if you reach out generally, someone will forward the email to us, but research@itvs.org gets to all of us.
Great.
Be delighted to talk further about it. We'll be kind of doing a couple more presentations with other groups, but I do think that we're particularly interested as well in how this may impact folks who are not necessarily also making documentaries, but as we said, who are storytellers, and just considering as well, what does it mean to take a story and tell it on screen, just in terms of the communities, or if there's underlying material that's nonfiction materials, always also very interesting to follow.
Okay. If people want to learn more about future presentations, do you have a mailing list, or can they socials that they can follow you on?
That's a great question. Because this is one of our earliest presentations, we haven't sorted that all out yet, but okay. I think maybe first and foremost, contacting us directly it's easy enough that way for starters. And then, and then we will, I'm sure, be posting more. I don't know if we have any more on Instagram or other updates that will be coming soon, but most likely, yeah.
Great.
We'll be at South by Southwest coming up in March.
Okay. I don't think we have any more questions, right? Last call for questions. Either raise your virtual hand, you'll pop up on the list. Otherwise, we'll kind of wrap this up. No more questions, right? So yeah, it just leaves me to thank a fantastic team here from ITVS. Sherry, thank you so much, Sherry Simpson.
Thank you.
Grace Anglin. Thank you,
Thanks,
Grace. And Justine, Armen.
Thanks all.
For handling all the chat in the background as well. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is me, Paul Cowling, signing off, saying thank you for joining us. Thank you for ITVS, and we will see you very soon.